The chamber was thick with unease, the kind that makes every shuffle of paper and click of a pen feel magnified. Cameras zoomed in, microphones buzzed, and the nation's eyes seemed fixed on the stage of confrontation about to unfold. Beth Van Duyne leaned forward, her lips curling with a smile that carried more venom than warmth. She spoke with sharp precision, her tone polished to sound confident, but dripping with condescension. The words landed like daggers, a calculated insult designed to wound in public view, the kind of jab meant to linger long after the meeting adjourned. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A ripple of discomfort moved across the room, some faces froze in stunned disbelief, others cracked into smirks, clearly entertained by the spectacle. It was as if Van Duyne had thrown down a gauntlet, daring anyone to challenge her authority. Her voice echoed with the kind of arrogance that thrives on silence, banking on the assumption that her target would shrink under the weight of her words. In that moment, she owned the air, or at least she believed she did. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat still, her expression unreadable. The insult hung between them like smoke, heavy and suffocating, waiting for a gust of wind to clear it away. Instead of rushing to respond, Crockett held the silence, a pause that only amplified the tension. Each second of her composure chipped away at the force of Van Duyne's arrogance, though the room hadn't yet realized it. The camera of imagination zooms in, Van Duyne with her poised smirk, Crockett with her calm restraint. Two women locked in a battle without yet speaking a word. The audience, whether seated in the chamber or watching through screens, felt the suspense coil tighter. Was Crockett going to absorb the insult, letting Van Duyne bask in her temporary victory? Or was she quietly preparing to turn the insult into something far greater? Whispers flitted through the gallery, the kind of murmurs that carry the sense that history might be forming in real time. The silence grew heavier, and all eyes turned toward Crockett, waiting for her to speak. The moment had been set like a stage, and everyone could sense that what came next would not just answer an insult, it would shift the entire balance of the room. The silence of that chamber could not last forever. What had begun as a single insult was already swelling into something larger, something that demanded explanation and weight. This wasn't just a casual sparring match in Washington. It was an encounter that carried the fingerprints of American identity itself. Every hearing of this nature is supposed to be about oversight, about governance, about the solemn duty of public service. But in that instant, the veneer of civility cracked, revealing what so many feared lurked beneath: a politics built on belittlement and spectacle. Beth Van Duyne had delivered her barb with the assumption that it would stick, that it would frame Jasmine Crockett as smaller, as weaker, as someone undeserving of her place at the table. What Van Duyne had not accounted for was that her words would instead frame the deeper stakes of the confrontation. It mattered because of who Crockett was, what she represented, and the people who saw themselves in her. To watch someone like Van Duyne, secure in privilege and power, use her platform to dismiss was not simply an individual attack. It was a message to every viewer who had ever been told they did not belong, who had ever been mocked for daring to take up space. In this way, the insult stopped being about two women in a committee room and instead became about the fabric of American democracy, about whose voice is silenced and whose voice is amplified. The tension in the chamber was only the visible layer of a much larger struggle. Across the country, headlines had already begun to capture snippets of the exchange. Phrases like "explosive moment" and "unexpected clash" flickered onto phone screens. On social media, short clips started making the rounds even before Crockett uttered her first word in reply. Audiences far from the Capitol leaned in, feeling the pull of a moment that seemed poised to define itself. People began tagging friends, writing captions like, "Wait until you see what happens next," feeding the collective sense that something bigger was brewing. The digital echo chamber heightened the drama long before the drama itself had even reached its climax. Inside the room, the tension worked like a coiled spring. Van Duyne, perhaps sensing victory in the silence, pressed her posture forward, clearly convinced that she had scored her point. Yet the power of Crockett's stillness only magnified the unease. The longer she sat, unmoved, the more obvious it became that she was not shaken. She was studying, calculating, allowing the insult to hang until it collapsed under its own arrogance. That patience created a vacuum, one that everyone else could feel but not yet named. Something was coming, and the weight of that expectation made the insult itself feel smaller with each passing second. For viewers, both in the chamber and beyond, the stakes began to crystallize. This was not simply about a quip that might make the evening news. It was about whether dignity could withstand and even conquer arrogance in its rawest form. The anticipation itself became the story. Students in classrooms, families at dinner tables, workers on lunch breaks who caught glimpses of the footage all began to sense that they were about to witness one of those rare political moments that refuses to stay contained, one of those scenes that becomes replayed, memed, debated, and remembered. The FOMO was undeniable. People whispered, texted, posted, "Don't scroll past this. Watch what happens next." It was the kind of moment that pulled even the disinterested into its gravity, because everyone wants to see the instant arrogance unravels and dignity takes its place. What had started as a smirk from Van Duyne was already morphing into a setup for something greater, something unforgettable. And as Crockett finally adjusted in her chair, taking in a breath as though ready to break her silence, the air seemed to freeze. Every person watching knew instinctively they were seconds away from history. Beth Van Duyne's confidence in that chamber did not appear out of nowhere. It was the product of years spent honing an image of toughness, of playing the part of a politician who thrived on bluntness and bravado. She had built her career by branding herself as someone unafraid to say what others wouldn't, a quality that won her both applause and criticism. Yet beneath that carefully polished exterior was a recurring pattern, a reliance on dismissive remarks, on belittling those who dared to challenge her. Her sharp tongue, often framed as candor, became a tool for silencing rather than debating. To her supporters, this was strength. To her critics, it was arrogance disguised as conviction. Her history carried contradictions that were impossible to ignore. She spoke often of family values, yet her tone in public hearings betrayed a lack of empathy for the families her policies touched. She projected the image of a leader dedicated to fairness, yet repeatedly dismissed opponents with ridicule instead of reason. Her persona was carefully curated, but in unscripted moments, the cracks showed. She seemed less interested in dialogue than in domination, less concerned with truth than with spectacle. Each exchange where she mocked or cut down an opponent became another stitch in the fabric of her reputation, a reputation that eventually carried her into that hearing room, smirk fixed, certain she could control the narrative. To understand why this moment carried so much weight, one had to see the pattern. Van Duyne had made a habit of treating politics as theater, where the most biting line won the day. Her style rewarded showmanship over substance. She thrived on viral clips where her barbs landed hard, where her opponents appeared caught off guard. Yet this same reliance on spectacle left her vulnerable, because arrogance has a way of blinding even the most practiced performer. What she underestimated was that one day she would face someone unwilling to play the role of her foil, someone who would not crumble under the force of her practiced scorn. The chamber itself seemed to remember echoes of her past clashes. Those who followed her career had seen her use the same strategy time and again. Smile, insult, wait for silence, and then bask in the aura of superiority. The move had worked for her before, making her appear sharp, in control, untouchable. But like any script repeated too often, its predictability began to show. Crockett's silence was not weakness, it was recognition of the pattern, a refusal to give Van Duyne the satisfaction of a predictable reaction. For the first time, the villain of this story was not in control of her own theater. The contrast between her image and her reality could not have been sharper. She stood for strength, but that strength was brittle. She stood for conviction, but that conviction bent easily when stripped of its stagecraft. She stood for confidence, but it was confidence born from rooms where others yielded, not where they resisted. By leaning once again on the tactic of humiliation, Van Duyne set herself up for a downfall she never saw coming. Arrogance, after all, is its own undoing. The narrative of her career up to this point resembled a tower built too quickly, bricks stacked without a foundation strong enough to last. Each insult added height, each dismissal made her appear taller, but the structure swayed with every gust of genuine opposition. What the audience was about to witness in this hearing was the moment when that tower finally toppled. Van Duyne believed her smirk would carry her through as it always had, that the room would tilt in her favor as it so often did. Instead, the silence she mistook for triumph was the calm before her collapse. Her downfall began not with Crockett's words, but with her own overconfidence. She had sharpened her insult too finely, pressed it too hard, assumed too quickly that the stage belonged only to her. The arrogance that once served her became the very flaw that exposed her. And as viewers leaned forward, sensing that this time would not end as the others had, Van Duyne's carefully crafted persona was already unraveling. She had set herself up as the villain without even realizing it, and in doing so, she made the audience hungry for her fall. Jasmine Crockett's story was never one of shortcuts or easy victories. Long before she walked into that chamber, she had been forged in the quiet crucibles of struggle that leave their mark on a person's voice, their gaze, their very posture. She carried herself with a kind of unshakable calm that could only be earned through years of fighting battles that didn't always come with cameras or applause. To understand her presence in that room, you had to see the road that led her there, the sacrifices, the doors slammed in her face, the countless times she was underestimated and dismissed, only to rise stronger. Her background was rooted in perseverance. Raised in an environment where little was handed freely, she learned early the meaning of resilience. Education was not just about grades or degrees but about survival, about carving a path in spaces where few expected her to thrive. She worked her way through challenges that might have broken others, each hurdle shaping the steel in her character. The law became her weapon, public service her stage, and truth her compass. With every case she took on and every community she defended, she built credibility the hard way, brick by brick, without shortcuts or favors. What made Crockett different was her refusal to detach her personal struggles from her public mission. She remembered what it meant to feel unheard, to feel like the odds were stacked against her. That memory followed her into every courtroom and every committee hearing, where she carried not only her own voice but the voices of countless others who never got the microphone. Her political journey was not about ambition for its own sake. It was about ensuring that people like her, people who had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously, were represented at the highest levels. Every step of her rise demanded strength. When critics tried to paint her as inexperienced, she leaned into her record of hard work. When opponents mocked her identity, she transformed that mockery into fuel. The scars of those battles became invisible armor, allowing her to walk into spaces where hostility was expected and still stand tall. She was not naive to the forces aligned against her. She knew that a woman like her, outspoken and unapologetic, would always be a target for those who thrived on belittlement. But instead of shrinking, she learned to wield that knowledge like a shield. Her composure in the chamber that day was not accidental. It was the product of years of being told to wait your turn, of being interrupted mid-sentence, of being told in 1,000 subtle ways that her voice did not matter. Every insult that had been hurled at her in her journey had prepared her for this stage. Where another might have bristled or lashed out, Crockett understood the power of patience. She knew the weight of timing, the art of letting arrogance reveal itself before dismantling it with precision. What gave her edge was her authenticity. She never pretended to be anything she wasn't. Her story resonated because it was real, because she had lived every ounce of the struggle she spoke about. When she talked about justice, she wasn't quoting from textbooks, she was recalling neighbors who had been overlooked, families who had been ignored, defendants who had no one else to fight for them. Her strength was grounded in lived experience, not abstract ideals. That grounding gave her words power that no smirk or insult could erase. By the time she faced Beth Van Duyne in that chamber, Crockett had already proven herself countless times in battles that lacked the spotlight. The confrontation was just another test, another attempt by power to silence her. Yet unlike so many before, this moment would not pass unnoticed. This was her opportunity to show, not just to her critics but to the entire country, what dignity looked like when pushed against the wall. Her origin story was not simply background, it was the foundation of the comeback she was about to deliver. What made her uniquely prepared for this clash was her history of turning humiliation into triumph. She had been doubted too many times to be rattled by one more insult. Where Van Duyne saw an easy target, Crockett saw a familiar script, one she had encountered in classrooms, in courts, in the political arena. And like every other time, she was ready not just to respond but to redefine the moment. The insult was supposed to diminish her. Instead, it unlocked the years of resilience that had made her who she was. When she finally prepared to speak, Crockett was not just defending herself. She was standing for everyone who had ever been talked down to, laughed at, or belittled for daring to take their place in the room. Her silence until that point was not weakness, it was a gathering storm. Her backstory had trained her for this exact moment, and when she opened her mouth, the words would carry the force of a lifetime of resilience. What Van Duyne thought would be an easy jab was about to meet a comeback sharpened by years of struggle, and the room was seconds away from witnessing why Jasmine Crockett could not be silenced. The silence that had gripped the chamber began to fracture as the exchange pushed forward. Beth Van Duyne, emboldened by the stillness and mistaking it for submission, leaned harder into her role as aggressor. Her voice cut through the air with renewed sharpness, each phrase sharpened like a blade. She spoke not to debate but to dominate, her words dripping with the smugness of someone who believed she had already won. Every sentence was calibrated to sting, every inflection carrying the weight of superiority. For those watching, it felt less like a discussion and more like a performance meant to humiliate. Jasmine Crockett, however, refused to mirror that aggression. She did not interrupt, did not roll her eyes, did not show the anger that would have justified Van Duyne's narrative. Instead, she remained poised, her stillness a kind of resistance that unnerved her opponent more than any loud retort could have. Her calm composure created an invisible mirror in which Van Duyne's arrogance reflected back at her, magnified and exposed. The more Van Duyne pushed, the clearer it became that she was not rattling Crockett at all. She was unraveling her own control. The chamber grew heavier with tension. Members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging quick glances, others scribbling nervously on their papers as though pretending to be distracted. The audience beyond the room, those watching the live feed, those glued to clips circulating on their phones could sense it too. This was no longer simply a heated discussion. It was becoming a test of endurance, a contest between arrogance straining louder and louder, and dignity waiting silently, choosing its moment. Van Duyne raised her voice slightly, pressing her words with the force of someone who feared losing ground. The faint crack in her tone betrayed it. Her control was slipping. Crockett's refusal to react seemed to mock her in silence, each second daring her to keep pressing, to keep exposing her own desperation. The imbalance was striking. On one side, a figure straining with effort to appear powerful. On the other, a woman seated firmly, shoulders squared, eyes steady, her restraint speaking louder than any words. The escalation reached a point where the insults began to lose their sharpness. What once landed like a dagger now sounded repetitive, desperate, even hollow. Those smirks that had greeted Van Duyne's first jab began to fade, replaced by quiet discomfort as people realized the attack was overstaying its welcome. The performance was turning against its performer, the arrogance beginning to look less like strength and more like insecurity. In that moment, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. The audience could feel that the balance of power had slipped, though Van Duyne seemed oblivious to it. She was playing to the cameras, but Crockett was playing to something deeper: the patience of timing, the dignity of restraint, the anticipation of a response that would matter more than any insult hurled before it. And then came the pause. Van Duyne's words trailed off, her performance finally hitting a lull. The silence returned, thicker now, heavier, weighted with expectation. All eyes turned back to Crockett. For minutes, the tension had escalated, the insults had piled up, the arrogance had swelled. But now the floor was open and everyone sensed what was coming. This was not going to be a simple rebuttal. This was going to be the kind of counterattack that doesn't just end an exchange, it defines it forever. The silence that followed Beth Van Duyne's last barb was almost unbearable. It stretched across the chamber like a taut wire, threatening to snap under its own weight. Every person in the room leaned forward, waiting, breath caught in their throats. For so long Van Duyne had filled the air with her voice, her arrogance, her unbroken string of insults. And now there was nothing, just the quiet anticipation of something about to shift. The cameras zoomed in, capturing Jasmine Crockett's still face, her steady eyes, her unshaken composure. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Crockett began not with a raised voice, but with a pause so deliberate it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Her lips parted slowly, and when she finally spoke, her words were measured, calm, precise. "Congresswoman," she said, her tone almost gentle, "I want to thank you." The audience frowned, puzzled, and Van Duyne herself looked startled, unsure if this was sarcasm or surrender. But then Crockett continued, and the trap was sprung. "Thank you for proving, in your own words, exactly why this conversation matters. Thank you for showing the American people what happens when arrogance replaces service, when performance takes the place of principle, and when personal attacks drown out the real issues facing this country." The chamber froze. The contrast was stunning. Where Van Duyne had been all fire and fury, Crockett was cool steel, slicing sharper for its restraint. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. She spoke of her journey, not in self-pity but in power, her family's sacrifices, the long nights of studying, the barriers faced and broken. She reframed every insult Van Duyne had hurled as proof of resilience. "You think my background is a weakness," she said evenly, "but it is my strength. You see my story as something to diminish, but it is the story of millions of Americans who rise every day, against odds stacked high, to serve this country with dignity." The words echoed across the chamber like a gavel striking again and again. Crockett didn't need to shout. Her calmness itself became the counterattack. Van Duyne shifted in her seat, the confidence draining from her face. Where once she had smirked, she now bit her lip. Where she had leaned forward aggressively, she now leaned back, unsure how to respond. The cameras caught everything, the villain's mask beginning to crack. Crockett pressed further, exposing contradictions in Van Duyne's record with surgical precision. She recalled moments when Van Duyne had claimed to defend values yet undermined them in policy. She drew lines between words and actions, arrogance and accountability. "You speak of patriotism," Crockett said, her voice still calm but growing firmer, "yet your actions divide rather than unite. You speak of service, yet use your platform to mock those who serve differently from you. You claim to protect families, yet you tear them down with cruelty when they don't look like yours." Each accusation landed not as a personal insult, but as undeniable evidence. The room reacted audibly now. Murmurs swelled. A few heads nodded. Even some who had sat stone-faced earlier could not disguise their shifts in expression. It was as if Crockett's words had broken through the performance, reaching something deeper that no amount of staged arrogance could drown out. And then came the moment, the crescendo. Crockett paused again, letting the silence hang before her final blow. "So let me be clear," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "You can attack me. You can insult me. You can try to turn my story into a punchline. But you will not erase the truth. You will not erase the people I represent. And you will not erase the values that built this country: dignity, sacrifice, and justice for all." The chamber erupted. Some gasped, others applauded, a wave of energy rippling through the space. Social media clips would later freeze on this exact moment, the look of determination etched into Crockett's face, the stunned silence of Van Duyne beside her. For the first time, the aggressor had nothing left to say. Van Duyne tried to smirk, to brush it off, but her eyes betrayed her. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. The applause, the murmurs of approval, the fire in the audience's reaction was all for Crockett. She had seized the narrative, flipped the insults, and turned them into a rallying cry. As the reaction swelled, Crockett leaned back in her chair, calm again, almost serene. She had not just defended herself, she had shifted the entire atmosphere of the debate. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate her had ended with a mic-drop moment that would live far beyond the walls of that chamber. The world outside would soon light up with this exchange. Hashtags were already forming, clips were already being edited, headlines were already drafting themselves. But inside the chamber, in that moment, it was enough that Jasmine Crockett had spoken her truth, and no insult could stand against it. It didn't take long for the moment to leap from the chamber to the screens of millions. Within minutes of Crockett's counterattack, clips of her takedown began circulating across social media, edited with captions, dramatic soundtracks, and replayed in slow motion to highlight Van Duyne's stunned silence. Twitter lit up first, hashtags erupting with speed. Hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag silenced with truth, hashtag dignity wins. What had been a tense exchange in a single room instantly transformed into a national event. On TikTok, creators stitched the clip with their own reactions: wide-eyed gasps, hands over mouths, exaggerated rewinds of Crockett's line, "You will not erase the people I represent." Some put it to music, others set it to flashing captions and bold red letters, but the message was always the same. This was the moment dignity triumphed over arrogance. Instagram reels spread like wildfire, influencers weighing in not just on the politics but on the poise, the style, the energy that Crockett brought to the exchange. Memes sprang up overnight: Van Duyne's faltering smirk captured mid-frame, juxtaposed with Crockett's calm, steely gaze, shared thousands of times as the ultimate before and after of a failed confrontation. Cable news picked it up within hours. Commentators replayed the moment again and again, some describing it as a masterclass in composure, others calling it the turning point in the tone of congressional debate. Panels broke down not just the words Crockett had used but the way she had delivered them: the pauses, the silences, the controlled energy that made the moment unforgettable. Even outlets that rarely covered exchanges of this kind couldn't resist. The spectacle was too magnetic. Celebrities chimed in, amplifying the ripple. A-list actors tweeted their support, musicians reposted the clip to Instagram stories with fire emojis, and comedians turned it into punchlines on late-night shows. What could have been just another clash in Washington instead took on the air of cultural theater, a scene that transcended politics and landed in the arena of pop culture. The audience wasn't just political junkies anymore, it was everyone with a phone, everyone craving a moment of raw, unscripted authenticity in an era of rehearsed sound bites. Van Duyne's allies tried to spin it, but every attempt looked weaker next to the viral juggernaut of Crockett's calm dismantling. Their statements fell flat, drowned out by the sheer volume of voices celebrating Crockett's words. Analysts pointed out the irony. Van Duyne had entered the chamber hoping for a headline-making insult, only to hand her opponent a global stage on which to shine. Meanwhile, Crockett's own supporters organized online watch parties, threading together compilations of her best debate moments, framing this latest one as the pinnacle. This isn't just about politics, one viral post read. This is about every person who's ever been underestimated, every voice that's ever been silenced, finally being heard. The comments section overflowed with stories of teachers, nurses, veterans, immigrants all claiming they saw themselves in her defiance, her dignity, her unshakable calm. As the days stretched on, the ripple only widened. Editorials praised her as a rising voice of courage, podcasts dissected the exchange as a lesson in rhetorical power, and grassroots organizers used the moment to galvanize new volunteers. The confrontation had started as a clash of personalities, but it had evolved into something symbolic, a cultural touchstone for the year. In living rooms across the country, families replayed the clip not just for entertainment but for inspiration. Parents told their children to watch how Crockett refused to meet insult with insult, but instead elevated the conversation to values and principles. Teachers used it in classrooms to spark discussions about dignity, resilience, and the importance of standing firm in one's truth. And through it all, one truth became undeniable. Crockett had not only silenced a room, she had sparked a movement of recognition, solidarity, and pride. What began as Van Duyne's attempt to humiliate ended as a turning point that people would reference for years whenever they needed a reminder of what dignity under fire truly looked like. As the noise of headlines, hashtags, and late-night jokes swirled around the country, the deeper meaning of the moment began to crystallize. For all the entertainment value, for all the viral edits and replay loops, what resonated most was not just the takedown, it was the lesson embedded within it. Jasmine Crockett had shown that dignity could be a weapon more powerful than ridicule, that calm conviction could dismantle arrogance more thoroughly than anger ever could. People weren't just celebrating a political victory, they were celebrating a reminder of who we are at our best. In speeches that followed, Crockett leaned into that truth. She reminded audiences that the insults hurled at her were not unique but echoed the same dismissals countless Americans face every day because of where they come from, how they look, or what they believe in. Instead of personalizing the attack, she universalized it. When they try to erase me, she told a crowd, they're trying to erase you too. And when I stand my ground, I am standing for every voice they would rather silence. Her words lifted the moment from a single clash into a story of collective resilience. The moral clarity spread beyond politics. Faith leaders preached about it on Sundays, pointing to Crockett's poise as a living example of turning the other cheek without turning away from the fight for justice. Parents tucked it into bedtime conversations, telling their kids, strength doesn't always mean shouting the loudest. Sometimes it means knowing who you are so completely that no insult can touch you. Even skeptics who rarely agreed with Crockett admitted there was something admirable in how she had shifted the focus from personality to principle. In the chamber itself, the exchange left a shadow of accountability. Van Duyne and others like her found their usual tactics of mockery less effective in the weeks that followed. Each time they attempted the same brand of sharp-edged arrogance, it was measured against Crockett's viral response. The standard had changed. What once seemed like clever political theater now seemed tired, desperate, and small. The resolution of this story wasn't about one person winning over another. It was about recentering what mattered: service over showmanship, sacrifice over smugness, truth over theatrics. Crockett's composure had reframed the entire encounter into a living parable, that the strength of democracy isn't found in the volume of insults but in the quiet resilience of those who refuse to be broken by them. In the end, the moment endured because it carried a universal lesson. We live in a world quick to mock and slow to listen, quick to divide and slow to heal. But Crockett's example offered a different path. It told viewers that they too could carry themselves with the same steadiness in the face of hostility. That even in small, everyday conflicts, there was power in refusing to let arrogance dictate the terms of the exchange. And so, as the clip replayed again and again, what lingered wasn't just the spectacle of Van Duyne silenced. It was the echo of Crockett's words, the weight of her calm, and the inspiration that dignity, quiet, unwavering, unshaken, could still cut through the noise and remind us all of who we are meant to be. The clip that started as a chamber confrontation had grown into something far larger, a cultural marker, a spark that reminded millions why voices like Jasmine Crockett's mattered. Her words lingered not just because they silenced an insult but because they carried a truth that transcended the room. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. That truth gave people a story to tell, a moment to share, a lesson to carry forward in their own lives. For viewers, this wasn't just about watching history unfold, it was about becoming part of it. Every share, every comment, every replay turned a political skirmish into a collective stand for respect and justice. The energy that once fueled outrage now fueled pride, binding people together across backgrounds, identities, and beliefs. And so the invitation is clear. If you believe in rising above hate, if you believe in service over showmanship, if you believe that dignity is the quiet strength that changes everything, then this story is yours too. Subscribe, share, join the conversation and carry the message forward. Because the louder arrogance shouts, the more powerful it is when dignity answers with calm truth. And together we can make sure that answer echoes far beyond this moment. What started as a sharp insult spiraled into a viral showdown now being replayed across every platform. Was this the moment that redefined political debate in 2025? Social media says yes. From explosive memes to shocking headlines, the ripple effects are impossible to ignore.